Hello, hopefully this is working. This is my very first live stream. so um, just in the chat, if you could type something to say that you can hear me, that would be absolutely great before we start. Fiona, hi. Hi, Susan. Okay, we've got people. Hello, Alan. Right, okay, so welcome. As I said, welcome to my very first live stream. A little bit scary, but I thought if not now, then when? So probably like you, I've been watching the news over the last week and sort of just being increasingly more sort of horrified and sad over what I'm seeing. So I think quite a lot of people are feeling powerless and sort of just wondering what on earth they can do. And I think as artists, we have a voice. Now, normally I would completely stay away from politics of any sort. But what I thought is that this is something that we can do. You've probably seen people creating paintings of sunflowers. Sunflower is a national flower of Ukraine. And so it's just a small gesture that we can all make individually, but it adds up. And hopefully, that small gesture is just a sort of clear symbol that we are thinking of all of the people in Ukraine, all the people across the world who are suffering from wars. And so just I thought I would do this live stream. I have the ability to do it. So just to help you, encourage you to do a little symbol, little painting of a sunflower, and then you can share it social media once you've painted it. So what we're going to do is have a look at, first of all, drawing. So you'll need a pencil to start with. Then what I'm going to do is use some pens. And so I've just got waterproof drawing pens, a mixture. Just make sure that they are waterproof, because the next step after the pen work is to use watercolors. So make sure that you've got some nice colour. If you don't have the pens, you don't have to use pen. You can stick to pencil. And if you don't have watercolors, then you can use whatever color media you have. Colored pencil, pastels, I don't know, whatever you want to use. So hopefully that's our plan. If you need the reference photograph, then that is in a link in the description below the video. So it's a royalty-free image, and you can find the link. You can go and download the reference from there. Okay, so looks like we have 13 people watching, which is brilliant. I did wonder whether I would have anybody at all, but this is a nice start. And again, it's just a nice gesture, hopefully, of support. So here we go. Let's have a look at getting started with drawing. So first of all, our flower, lovely positive symbol, sunflower, I always thought anyway. So what we want is to have a look at the shape. We want basic shapes first, very light lines, and then we can get on to having a bit more detail. So the first thing to do is to have a look at the middle of the flower, the shape of that. And it's not a circle. Our flower is slightly to one side. So you want to have an ellipse, a nice elliptical round shape for your center of your flower. So have a nice bit of an angle on there as well. So I just put that just on the edge there, so you can just see what I'm going for. I want a kind of diagonal through the middle. So that's going to be our middle of our sunflower. You then want to have a look at the outside petals. So how big a shape do you need? And what you'll probably see is the shape does change slightly as we come around. So we've got reasonably high petals at the top of this particular reference, and then we've got quite a long way out to the side, but over here can you see that those are much shorter? And of course these ones that are facing towards us, those petals on the other side are going to be much shorter. So I want a reasonable distance up here, a reasonable distance down here. Let's take it in a bit there, take it out a bit there, and take it in a little bit on this side. So you can see it's a bit of a wonky shape. So this is very much just finding your way from the very basics, finding the shape that you need. The next thing that I'm going to do is from the middle of our flower, I'm going to use that to help me place the stem. So you don't want to have the stem going off from a funny angle, because it won't look like it's connected properly. So the stem of our sunflower should be coming directly from the center here. So we've got to imagine X-ray through the back. So if you go in and have a look through the center, then just have your lines carrying down from there. Then that will help you to place it so that it makes sense there. Okay, so it's just a little bit of a guideline to get us started before we go in and start drawing any further. So there we go. We've got lips in the middle. Keep it all nice and light. You've also got your rounded shape that's going to encompass all of the petals, and through the middle, you can find the middle by drawing a little bit of a cross through there. Then you can place the stem through the back. Now what I'm going to do, before we get any further, I'm going to get rid of that sort of X-ray image, because that served its purpose. Now we won't need that again. And what we want to do is make the next stage putting on the petals. So while you're just getting those shapes, the paper that I'm working on is hot pressed watercolor paper, but of course you can use whatever papers you like. If you're going to be putting watercolor on it, then make sure that it is something that's quite heavyweight that will hold the watercolors. Okay, so then let's have a look at the petal shapes. Now, when I'm looking at a flower to draw, what I tend to do is, if there's a lot of petals, I look for the gaps between the petals. The gaps always, I think, give character, and they also give a sense of the shape a little bit more of each individual petal. So what you want is to have a look for the main gaps. Now I can see one on the corner here, and so that's what I'm going to start with. I'm just going to draw that triangle in, and then I might sort of do a rough outline of the two or three petals that are in there, and then I'll have a look at this triangle, this gap, a little bit further down. So it's all quite rough to start with. You don't want to be starting with a very detailed petal and then you carry around and then you find you've got a gap or you haven't got enough room to put them all in. So then we can go down and have a look at next sort of prominent shape. So we've got this one, this petal that sticks out a bit further. We've got a small one that's just dotted in behind. Then we've got lots that, again, they're just sort of a little bit further out. So I'm going to make a sort of sweeping just space there, and I'm just going to move down to the next gap that I can see that comes further in. So this will help make sure that we've got everything with enough room to put it in properly before you go in and draw detail. So there is a teeny little petal on the side sticking out before we've got a wider one down the bottom here. Again, just roughly to start with. You can come back, you can do more. So then as I come round, I'm looking at the next sort of shapes, any gaps, any triangles, any main sort of blocks of petal. Where do they come from? Where do they go to? And just sort of looking for the main shapes as we work our way around, so we don't get lost hopefully when we try and put these petals in. Okay, so also use the stem to help you. So we've got this gap here, and then we've got a petal that's just coming over the stem with another one just slotted behind there. And carrying on from there, we've got a lovely sort of triangular gap again. Lots and lots of triangles in this. And so have a look at those shapes. So if you need to, you can always think about coming up a little bit higher, another prominent gap, and then work your way around. So I've left a little gap here. I've moved up to that prominent gap, and now I'm going to come back down and work within that gap because there's a little bit more going on here, and I don't want to get too carried away and then lose sight of where I was in the overall scheme of things. Okay, so there we have a very sort of rounded shape behind. Again, there's lots and lots of overlap, so do watch out for that. Okay, so that is our longer one, that's that one. So I probably need that overlapped one. So this is a little one in front. Well, I say little one, it looks little because it's foreshortened. It's facing towards us more. Now, if you are struggling with getting all the petals in the right places, it doesn't matter if you do a little bit of invention, okay? You can get away with slightly moving things about if you have to. So don't panic as you're drawing. Take your time. If you do want to move some petals around, if you're struggling, then it's absolutely fine to do that. Okay, so there we go. Let's come back up. Let's finish off looking at this section at the top. Again, I'm going to have a look for some prominent gaps. So there's quite a wide shape up here. We've got another petal coming in through this section with a tiny little gap there. Okay, so hopefully this is making sense. But it's looking for those outside edges, looking for the shapes. You're not really thinking too much about um, the subject at the moment. It's more about really focusing in on what shapes you're seeing. As with any sort of drawing, it's a different sort of way of thinking. You've got to use your visual mind rather than your sort of day-to-day way of thinking about things. So it's not just we're drawing a flower, it's what shapes am I seeing? How long is that shape? How wide is that shape? So have a think about that. Now, what I've done is on this side we have the sepals, the green bits, fronds behind. And so I haven't drawn those in at the moment. What I'm going to do is come back over here and draw them in now. So a lovely little curvy edge. I like that little detail. It's nice if you can pick out a little bit of character in your flower like that. Make it look more sunflowery. So another little green section just slots in behind here. And in this gap, there is another green sepal there. And then we've got one, again, just coming out. Let's put a bit of a curve on the end as well. Coming down here, another little green sepal, a hint of greenery behind that section. This needs to be a bit more pointed down here. And so that green sepal is just curling round from behind there. And we've got another one just in here. So I think that's all of them. Oh, there might be a hint up there. It's always one hiding, isn't there? Right, so I think that it's looking quite drawn out on this side. Let's have another look at this section. I think this lower section is probably, because there are so many petals visible and they're all clumped together, it's probably one of the harder sections to draw. So let's have a look at that. So I'm just going to go in with, again, the main shapes on the outside edge. That's what I want to look for now. Having a look for those gaps, the little triangular gaps between. I'm thinking about sort of how wide. So I made that a little bit wide to start with. Let's take it back in. So again, if you have any questions about the technique or the materials that I'm using, then feel free to put them in the chat as we go along. I'll keep glancing up at the screen and seeing if there's anything there. Okay, so as I'm talking, I'm getting distracted. And I think what I've done is I've done what I've told you not to do. Is I've started from one end and I've ended up with too much space down the bottom for what I wanted. Now, if that happens to you, you can either rub it out and redraw or add a few more petals. I think because it's only a little bit of a distance there, I am going to just cheat a bit and go in with 2 more petals in here. So let's put a bit of a bigger gap between that one and get rid of that bit. So I think we've ended up maybe just with, if I've got that gap here, maybe just one extra. So yeah, you can, what I should have done is chosen a spot in the middle and then worked one way to the other way. Generally that works quite well, but as I said, you don't need to panic. Okay, so let's just tidy up some of these lines a little bit. And then what we can do is working down from our outside edge, we can work in towards the middle and think about any petals that are overlapping. And there are many petals overlapping in a sunflower. So you can see here in this little section, just the overlap through there. There's a petal just slotted behind this longer one. So again, it's looking for the shapes, basic shapes. What are you seeing? And what's in front, what's behind? That's what you need to be trying to work out. So quite a lot of these petals are quite slim. You don't want to make them sort of too chunky. Again, I think there's many different sort of varieties of sunflowers. So some will be a little bit different to the one I'm drawing. But this one is what I think of as a sunflower. So it's got lovely sort of thin petals, lots of overlaps, lots of layers. Very interesting to draw. It's got a nice sort of pattern to it, so you will see that quite often there is a petal sort of in the middle, and it just comes towards one of the gaps on the other side. So do have a look for little details like that that you can add in. So this little shape, just gonna slim it down a bit, move it across a little. So you can make a little tiny adjustments as you go along, as you fill in the entirety of the petal shape. If you want to move your outline or adjust it just a little, then that's fine. Drawing is a process. You don't have to get to the final result straight away. It's about learning about what you're drawing as you draw. So if you want to make small adjustments, bring something a bit lower, bit to the right, bit to the left, that's all part of you finding your way, discovering the shapes and the details of this particular flower. So this little clump here, this is where we start to get the foreshortened petals, and into the center there is one that is looking as if it's sort of coming across. It's over the center of the middle of the flower. And so what I want is a nice sort of little shape coming through like that. It also has another foreshortened petal just nestled behind, and that has a kind of point to the end of it like so. Okay, and then that will help me to work out how I'm going to split this shape into two petals, because there is an overlap again, one overlapping the other just so. Okay, now this is where it gets a bit tricky. There are some very small shapes because you're seeing the petals straight on. So it's that thing of, we know what a hand looks like, but when you turn a hand like that, it's a completely different shape. So this is what we're seeing. We're seeing the petal sort of straight on from the outer edge, the tip of it. So it looks a very, very different sort of shape than what you know a petal to be. So it is very much, you've got to observe, what are you seeing? Make sure that you draw the shape that you are actually seeing. So again, if you need to make some small adjustments as you come around, then don't be afraid to do that. I'm going to just create a slightly bigger gap in here. So moving the petal just down a little bit from where I had it originally. It's not going to cause a problem. You can, as you go around, take away some of the guidelines that we started with. If you no longer need them, then they can disappear as you work your way around. So this is, again, a nice little shape. It's a bit overlapped. So we're seeing the top of that petal, and then we're seeing a little bit of the underneath of it. You're seeing the side of it that's kind of lit up a bit more, and then we've got the other side of it as well. So it's quite a lot going on in that one little petal shape. But again, it's that's going to give it character. So it is a good thing to look for. So then I want to have a slightly curved shape that comes in, almost sort of blends in with the one above. Comes in around there. We've got this long thin petal. We've got that wide shape behind. I think there's a hint of another petal just folded in somewhere around there as well. So I'm just going to add that line. And then, okay, we're getting there, working our way around. Hopefully you're getting there as well. And so next thing to look for is to work out what's going on in this upper section. Again, it's a little bit complicated to see. So you might want to just have a look at some of the shapes down the bottom as well. That might give you a helpful sort of clue as to what petals are in front, which petals are behind, and separating them out a little more. So we have this wider shape in front. It's going to come down to there. That one is actually a little bit more in front of the other. I'm going to change that around the order. And then we've got this lovely little thin shape. But just watch that on the edge of it, this wide petal, it kind of almost crosses over, it just sort of kisses the edge of it. So always be aware as you're drawing in these shapes, what's in front, what's behind. And just relax into the drawing. Okay, so I think that has taken us all the way around. I think we've got it covered. So just make sure that as you're drawing, oops, it's falling down, and that you constantly looking at the shapes, look at the overall thing. Make sure that some of the petals aren't significantly bigger or smaller than the others. There, as I said, there's difference in size or in what we can see of the size because of the angle. But just make sure that you're looking, judging against all the separate parts. And what I'm going to do next is to just put in the center. So there is a darker center to our sunflower. I'm just going to make a note of where that needs to go. Again, it's an ellipse, not a circle. And just check, are there bits of greenery in the right place, a stalk? Maybe that could have a bit of detail. So let's have a look at some of the little buds, little hints of stem. So we've got a little shape, bit like a diamond shape there, a little curved shape further way down. Let's put in another, almost like a little heart shape. It's quite nice detail, isn't it? Bit of a heart on there. Okay, so that's our main bit of drawing with pencil. What I'm going to do next is to use pen and work over the pencil lines. As I do that, I'm going to use a little bit more of a descriptive line in places. I'm also going to try and add a little bit more detail as I go along. So if you have some drawing pens that are waterproof, then you can use just black if you've got black. If you've got grey, you could have a bit of variety between using black and grey. If you've got different sizes of pen, then again you can play with having different sizes. So I've got here a 0.1, a 0.05, so that's much smaller. I've also got a grey 0.1, so I can play around with using different sizes of pen nib and also using lighter and darker. If anyone watching wants to use a dip pen with a pot of ink, that's also possible. Make sure that the ink is waterproof. So like an Indian ink, it will dry waterproof and you can put your watercolor over the top. So yeah, you can play with that. And if you have watered ink, if you have watery ink in a pot, then of course you can always water some down and get a lighter grey. So yeah, and the sizes are 0.1, 0.05. Those are the two sizes that I'll use. And then the third one is just a grey. So if I wanted to have a lighter line, then I can use that. Okay, so when I'm putting in the details, actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the outer edge of the inner part of the sunflower. So what you can see are lots and lots of little circles and tiny little dashy type shapes on the edge. And again, that's just going to make it look like a sunflower. So what I want is to get those tiny little shapes in as they overlap the petals on this side. So lots and lots of little clustered rounded shapes. Don't make them too similar. Make sure that they have a bit of difference to them, a bit of variety. They don't have to be hugely neat either. You can, I find that if you sort of try and cluster things and add a bit of variety, so again, get some gaps in between. It's not all completely saturated with these dots on the edge. There are some nice, decent gaps in between. Have a look at that. Make some come out further than others. I'm going to add just two a little bit higher up there. Going to add another one sort of up there. So we've got a bit of variety in what's going on this edge. Again, it's all giving it a bit of character, a bit of uniqueness to the flower. Which, when you're drawing anything natural, you don't want anything to be too controlled, too neat and orderly. You want some variety. Okay, so on this edge, we actually have the petals overlap in the middle, so I don't need to do the little dots on this side. only if you can see them overlap in the petals do you need to do that along the edge. Okay, so into the center of our flower, hopefully what you can see is it's quite dark in here, but there's a little bit of a sort of cone type shape. So I'm just going to, at the moment, create some lines, some little hatched lines, which I will end up putting a bit of cross hatching probably. So they are, I am sort of feathering them a bit. It's going in with a little bit of a softened edge. Again, if you're going to put colour, you can add to this far more with your watercolours when you get that far. But it's good to add a bit of structure and texture even before that stage. So lots of little lines, lots of little dashes. As you come out from there, again, we may want to do more sort of stippling. I say stippling, but you don't have to be neat. It can be more of a dash than a dot. Just on the other side here. And if you want to, you can put in more of these little circles. Now, if you are looking really closely at the pattern in the center area, then you would see that there is a sort of spiraling pattern to the shape, how these all these little stamen little circles are placed. So that might help you if you want to come in and do some loose marks. Just give a bit of a structure to how you want to go about that. So you can see I'm just sort of spiraling my way around, not being as neat as I was on the outside because it's going to be less obvious in this dark mass, but it's just there to add a bit of a sort of textural descriptive line in quite a quick way. So it's lots and lots of little dashes, little circular squiggles. You can have a little bit of fun with this. Keep your lines nice and loose. Again, you want to have variety in the line, so don't make everything too similar, alternate some sort of dashes, some sort of more clear circles, some half circles. Just keep it quite loose and almost sort of scribbly in a way. It's there to add the texture and a hint of what's going on. As long as you've got more detail on the outside edge, then it kind of tricks your eye into believing that that carries on into the middle. You don't have to do the exact sort of same thing all the way across. Otherwise, it's going to take ages. Okay, so then let's have a look at the petals themselves. So again, you may want to go in, first of all, outside edge, and just neaten up the shapes of those outer edges. And I think what I'll do is I'll do all of those first, and then I'll come back with the smaller pen size and work some of the creases within the petal with that. So if you don't have a different pen size, that's where you could use a lighter colour. So you can use your grey, your watered down ink. Now, as you're doing these outer petals, if you want to, you can have a nice solid line to them. If you prefer, and you want maybe a little bit sense of movement, so maybe the petals are sort of fluttering in the wind a bit more, then you can have a slightly broken line or slightly sort of thinning and thickening line. If you play with the pen, even these drawing pens, if you put the pen on its side, you will get a thinner line than if you hold it upright. So you can play with how you're drawing, what sort of angle you're drawing at, to have thinner and thicker lines in different areas. And again, it's just gonna make the drawing a little bit more interesting, add a bit of variety and a bit of character to your drawing. I think when you're using ink, if you've got that pencil guideline, you can be really confident with the lines that you're putting on. You can play with the lines that you're using with a bit more confidence. So all those sketchy pencil lines, we may have had quite a few sort of lines that's all gone a bit sort of blurry, a bit feathery to the line. Now, as you're working your way over, go in with confidence and really create a strong, powerful line, which is going to be lovely and clear and crisp. Don't go back over it and add 3 lines where one could do the job. And the other thing is you can play with the edges. If you want to create a bit more curl, or a little bit more curve onto some of the petals, you can add a bit of extra character than what you're seeing in the reference. So you can put your own little twist on it. That's absolutely fine. And so our foreshortened petals, again, just be careful that you're looking at the shape, you're observing the shape still, and you're really trying to get in exactly what you're seeing here. Don't forget to draw the sepals as you go along. It's a good idea to keep looking at your reference photo. Even though you're following pencil lines that are already drawn, make sure that you do look back at the reference. You don't sort of rely on what's there, because you may want to make some adjustments even at this stage. If you see something that you want to move just a little bit over, or add a bit more curve, change the shape slightly, then now is the time to do it, because once the pen's on, it's there. So remember, if you want any questions answered, or just let me know how you're getting on. If you're drawing along with me, then just drop a little line in the chat and I'll know that you're still there with me. Thank you, Fiona. Fiona's drawing along. Hopefully it's going well. Again, with something like this, it is very much sort of your personal interpretation that counts. It doesn't have to be a masterpiece, it just has to be there and for a reason. So let's just keep going. And again, just make sure you're capturing the character of the flower. What about the stem, says Alan? Yes, we will get to the stem. That needs to be done in pen as well. So I've just got a few more petals left, and then I'll be doing the stem afterwards. So let's just have a quick look at this folded over one, the one with a funny kind of shape to the fold. Just make sure that you're, again, observing. Really see whether you can get the detail of that in. I'm just going to overlap the one sitting there behind. So remember, nice, confident lines. There we are. So there's our outlines to the petals. Oh no, Susan's waterproof pen has decided to give up. Right, well, you can, if you want to use watercolour, then any water media really over it, then it does have to be a waterproof pen. But what you could do is if you use an ordinary pen, you could use coloured pencils or some other form of dry colour instead as another option. Sometimes if you're working on watercolour paper, they don't like very textured paper. Sometimes it does damage the nib, but sometimes I find if you let it rest for a little while, then it will start working again. So just maybe try that as well, Sue. Right, so the stem, let's have a look at that. Now, again, it's quite a fuzzy, sort of furry stem. And so sometimes what I would do for something like this is I would actually use masking fluid and reserve some little white dots, little tiny white dots on the side. I'm not going to do that today. What I would do instead, because we're using the pen, is I'm going to do some little dots. And if you did have a white pen, then what you could do is once the watercolor is all dried, you could add some more little dots of white along the edge. So you'll have black dots and white dots, and it just hopefully will make it look a little bit fuzzy and give a bit more character to what's going on there. So some little dots and dashes, not a solid line. Yes, Suzanne, white gel pen would be fine. So you just need to make sure that all the watercolor that you use is completely dry, and then white gel pen, sort of white Posca marker type pens, even Tipp-Ex I love, but if that's what you've got, then it could work, that's fine. So yeah, lots and lots of tiny dots. Bit of a sort of time consuming thing to do, but it will give you a nice sort of soft fuzzy edge. They are very sort of furry stem sunflowers. Quite interesting. Again, don't be too neat. You can have some dots coming out a little bit further than others. It's all part of the texture, the variety of the flower. I'm going to also do some dots around this little heart shape that I have at the very bottom here. So a little darker section on the side. And a few sort of dark sections. I'm just looking which side's darker. Is there a little shadow sort of down there? Just a few more dots. If you want to do more dots, if you're enjoying the dots, then you could, in theory, continue doing that and add in lots more into the shadowy areas. I'm just going to do a bit at the very top. Now this is where you decide how much pen do you need, how much watercolor work are you going to do. So you don't need to do huge amounts of both. You want to have one or the other doing the majority of the work. Now I'm enjoying the pen. So I'm putting a few more dots along the darker side here, but not a huge amount, not too dark, because I don't want to fill it all in, because then the watercolor wouldn't have very much to do. You want always to have a bit of a balance. So one may take the lead, one medium may take the lead, but they've got to work together. And isn't that a message? You've got to work together. Okay, so there we go. We've got lovely sort of stippled dots. Hopefully that's giving nice fuzzy texture. Right, let's do just a teeny bit more with pen. I'm going to change to using the smaller nib size. So this is the 0.05. And I'm just going to do a few little hints within the petal structure into the little shapes, looking for the veins. And again, it's just going to be a hint. I don't want to do too much, but just a few sort of lines showing where the main veins, where the main folds are going to be. Again, nice confident lines. Don't do too many, otherwise it will start to look feathery rather than petals. So just keep it to a minimum. Just where can you see sort of the darker lines? If there is a folded petal or folded edge, you may want to go over and sort of differentiate what's the lighter to the darker side. So I am being very selective. I'm being very minimal with these smaller lines. If I was doing a pencil sketch and I was going to do shading, then of course I would be doing an awful lot more. But this, the majority of the work here should be done with the colour media. So it's just going to give you, again, a bit of a guideline. It's going to sort of help differentiate what's a darker sort of fold or vein and where the lighter ones are. Anything that's a cast shadow, so looking at this sort of shape here, there is a kind of line across here where there's a cast shadow from the petal above. Don't draw that in. That is something that is not existing in reality. It's a cast shadow, it's not an actual object. So don't sort of put a line there, but when you get to the colour, then you can think about adding in a little bit more darkness to create those cast shadows. So it's more the veins and the folds, something that you would be able to feel if you were touching the petal. Those are what you want to be putting in. So if there's a fold, sort of a dip or a vein, then put a line, just a thin line there. If there is a cast shadow, that's not something you'd be able to feel, so don't draw it. Okay, that's looking a bit better. So I'm just having a look. In this one, there's a little bit of a fold through the middle there, a little bit of fold here, and hint on the other side as well. A little bit there. I think that looks like it's pretty much there. I'm just going to add another little shape in down here. Break that up a bit. There we go. So that is our line work. That's the pen done. And so what I would do is, before you put any colour on, is to make sure that the pencil lines, all your guidelines, your original drawing gets rubbed out. And you might find, look, there's a bit there, I've missed with the pen. So as you go around, just fill in anything that actually just suddenly disappears because you've missed it. There's always one or two areas you think you've drawn everything, and then you rub it out and it disappears completely. So I'm using putty rubber, which is a nice gentle eraser that won't damage the paper surface. If you're using a watercolor paper, some of those surfaces can be quite fragile, so you don't want to be using a hard plastic eraser on them particularly. And so a nice putty rubber will do the job. And the other advantage is it doesn't create lots of rubbings, lots of dust. So you don't need to clean that away. So just make sure that your drawing is nice and tidied up. Now, just make sure that there's nothing on there. So we have now all of our lovely pen work, and we can have a look at the watercolors. Now I'm just going to move my board over to the side and bring the colour over. So tip for you is before you do anything else with your watercolor, use a spray bottle of water and just go over the top of your colors to moisten them up, and that will make it much easier to pull the color out when you go over them with the brush. So the colors that you want to use, start off with a light yellow. Now this yellow is lemon yellow, so I could pull out a bit of that. You can see nice and bright, a little bit sort of as acidic color, so we won't use that everywhere, but on the very light areas that can work quite well. And then if you've got a slightly warmer yellow, so this is Windsor yellow, but if you've got a cadmium yellow, then that will do nicely. And you can see that's just a little bit warmer. Fiona says that's a good tip, spraying the paints. Yes, yeah, it is. It does work very, very well. I always try and do that a little bit before. Now let's have a look at, if you've got a deeper yellow, you may want to also have that as a bit of a shadow color. If you haven't got a deep yellow, maybe use an orange or a red mixed with your cadmium or your Windsor yellow, the medium one, and create a little bit more of a deeper shadowy color as well. And then I think what I'll do, sticking to our theme, is I'm going to use a blue into the background. Now I think the blue I'm going to use is going to be phthalo blue. It might be a little bit dark, so you may need to water the blue down. If you might want to also use, if you've got cerulean blue, or this is manganese blue, then you may want to use that. I might mix the two together, actually. We'll see what it looks like. We'll do a little test. That might be a bit closer. So we want, well, I am going to do Ukrainian flag colours as close as I can with watercolour anyway. But of course you can put in whatever colour you like. If you want to go add in more, then that's absolutely fine. For the centre of the flower, you may want to have a bit of a brown or even a purple, something to add a bit of contrast, a little bit of darkness. So the browns that I've got burnt sienna, which is quite a nice warm colour, but I've also got burnt umber if I want to go nice and dark, and of course I can mix that with the blue and make it even darker. If you wanted to put a bit of more of a contrasting colour, you could go in and put a teeny bit of purple, so you use a blue and a red, something like crimson, and make your own purple maybe, and add a bit of that to really sort of zing the colours. Right. So the way that you apply your watercolour, again, it's a bit up to you, what you personally like, and it's very much so you can do your own thing here. So if you like working wet on wet, then you could put water down first and then splash the colours over, have a bit of an abstract sort of splash of colour. If you want to be nice and detailed and sort of realistic, then maybe just sort of paint section by section. So yes, it is very much your own thing what do you want to do? What do you want to achieve? The pen line there is giving you all of the detail, but the paint, it can be much looser in the way that you apply it. So yeah, drop in the comment. What do you prefer? Loose sort of style or detailed? What are you going to do? I'm not sure. So you can influence the direction that this takes if you want to. So as you're having a think, I'll just talk about the brushes I've got on standby here. So I have a large Hake watercolor brush. I've got some nice pointed round brushes. I've got a little liner brush if we go for some detail. So we want probably big brushes to start off with. And then you can have a think about working into the detail. We've got a whole list. Detailed, loose. Loose, but I'm not good at it. Wet on wet, says Paul. Alan, I think you're being outvoted at the moment. Again, you can do your own thing. You can do your own thing with it. So, should we go slightly loose to start with? And then if you choose, you can put a bit more detail over the top. So if we want wet on wet, you want to start off with water, just plain water. Hannah says, okay, let's hang loose. Okay. So yeah, just water to start. Then you can drop your colour onto it. So if we're going really loose, I'm not going to worry too much about edges. If you want to go really, really loose, put water over the whole thing. See what happens. Maybe I won't go quite that far, but I will just apply the colour to the flower first, and then if it bleeds into the background, I'm not too worried, and we will sort out a looser background as we go along. I'm just going to put some water into the stem as well. So it's a little bit messy. Can you see I've just put water on very, very loosely. But of course, don't make puddles. Whenever you're doing wet on wet, don't make puddles. Don't put so much water down that it's going to form big blobs of water. So even it out as much as possible. Normally I would be much, much neater if I wanted to keep the edges of the petals more in the lines. But if we're going loose, I'm not going to worry about that. So let's have a look first of all at putting on the light yellow. So the lightest yellow you have, in that case, it's probably lemon yellow, but work with the colours that you have. I'm using Winsor Lemon Yellow. And I'm going to apply that pretty much all over because it's the lightest colour. It can be worked over the top of to add depth where needed. If you put it over the stamen, the bits are going to go green. That's not a problem because you can put the green over the top. And so what you can do as well is put that yellow on the stem. Okay, so because this is quite big, what I'm going to do is to show you before it dries. You might want to work in some sections if you want to create a little bit more looseness. So if I put the medium yellow over the top while it is still wet, I'm putting it on quite thick. It will bleed out a little bit, but it won't go too far. So you can use that to pick out where you want to put a little bit more darkness. If it travels too far, if you've got a bit of paper towel, you can always put a bit more light back into an area by lifting out. So there might be some areas that you want to sort of just lift and make a bit lighter if needed. Now this is also where our spray bottle becomes useful, because if you want to go really loose, or you finding that your paper is drying before you've got all the way around, you can spray it with a bit of extra water. It will create some very loose areas, because again you haven't got much control of where it sprays. And it can create some very interesting effects actually. So light yellow to start. Again, it can just come and bleed into the middle. That's fine. Just be careful with this. Don't want it to dry as a hard edge down there, so I'm just going to come and sort that out. Okay, so I'm going to work into that with my medium yellow again, and then the darker yellow. The more paint, the more wet paint and water that there is on the surface, the longer it will take to dry. So as you work, you are creating sort of more wetness to the surface. It will take longer to dry, hopefully. And then you have more time to work wet into wet. Okay, so we've got some lighter areas that have just got a little bit of yellow on. We've got some darker areas as well. And then we can use our dark yellow or our orange yellow mix. And into that, keeping it loose. If yours has dried already, don't panic, because you can then work with glazes and you can layer paint over the top. Now that is very strong, isn't it? Let's have some bright colour. I think we need a bit of bright colour, don't we? So that's nice and strong, sort of orangey yellow, and I'm just trying to keep it to the areas of shadow mainly. you can go in, you can create some lines of dark along those veins. So where you've done the paint, the pen veins, you can follow your lines with the darker yellow and create a little bit more sense of the folds and the veins. And if you're working on a wet surface, what should happen is that you get a slightly softened line. Depending on how wet your paint is and how wet the surface is, it will bleed out to varying amounts. So if it's bleeding too far, use slightly thicker paint or wait for the surface to dry a little bit more. If it's not bleeding out enough, then possibly think about using a spray of water over the top to add a little bit more wetness to the surface. So it should be creating those lovely sort of softened lines, nothing too hard. If you're getting hard lines, then your paper's too dry. Now you probably see, maybe, well, it doesn't seem to show up too much on screen, but my paper is buckling because I am working on unstretched paper. Because this was a bit of a last minute thing, I didn't have time to stretch another piece of paper. So I'm having to put up with a bit of paper buckling, which is not great, but I can cope with that. It's always better to work on stretched paper where possible, especially if the paper is not too thick and you're using wet on wet methods. So if anyone wants to learn how to stretch paper, I do have a video on this channel on YouTube that will be helpful for you. But there we go, we've got it's not too bad, but it is buckling quite a bit just down here. Anyway, there we go, we've got some nice bright yellows put down. I'm going to let those dry and then I'll decide whether I want to brighten up the yellows any more. And if I do, then I will put on a glaze. What weight is the paper? Well, it is 300 GSM, it says, but it doesn't feel as thick as other 300 GSM papers. I think it's because it's hot pressed. It doesn't have sort of the same texture to it. I don't know. But it is buckling quite a lot under that amount of water. Some papers cope better than others, I find, and it will depend on how the paper's made, whether it's sized, internally, externally, all sorts of lots of factors with paper as to which ones cope better. So I think what we need is a little bit more looseless. It's not loose enough yet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the spray bottle and I'm going to play. This is where it could all go wrong or it could all go very right. Now let's pick a direction. What direction? I think from behind. So I'm going to use spray bottle up in the corner and up near to the flower. We'll get a bit of bleed out from the yellow. So this again, it's where you may need to add more yellow if you're going to use the spray bottle to bleed the yellow slightly. There we are. So I'm going to create a bit of a wash, a directional wash of colour using some of those yellows. So this is the medium yellow again, not the dark one, the medium one. It's not wet all over the paper. It's just in a few select areas. Because then what I can do is I can also add in the blues. Now this is the risky bit because you don't want the blues to travel into the flower too much. So you've got to have a little bit of control, but also a little bit of freedom in where it goes. So I'm going to use gravity to help pull the blue away from the flower as it comes down. If it makes green in a few places, that's not too much of a problem. Just hopefully have enough sort of blues that you can see that it's blue originally. Now if you've got bleed over the edge of the petals and you want to get rid of that, you don't necessarily have to. You're being loose with your painting. But if you want to get rid of it, paper towel, just dab it over before it has chance to dry in, and that will sort it out. So there we go, a little bit more looseness, a little bit more reckless painting. That's what you think you would call it, being a bit reckless with your colour. Splash it on, see what happens. If you decide that you need to add a bit more or create a bit more control around some of it, then play with adding it on dry as well. Oops, even going on dry, I've gone over the edge. There we go. So if you're doing that, if you've got more textured paper, you can play with having a bit of dry brush effect to add more texture that way. See what happens. If you don't want to do too much of sort of the wash like this, then of course you can always add your background on afterwards once the flower has dried, and be a little bit more careful. So again, it's up to you. And I'm sure Alan is looking at this going, oh, it's a bit scary. Wants to be a bit more controlled. That's fine. You can be a bit more controlled with how you're putting on the colour. Those of you who love to splash it on, then have a bit of fun with how you're adding your colour, and you will get some so nice loose effects, very unpredictable effects quite often. But this is very much how the example sunflower I put up was done, so it's quite nice to have a little bit of this added into the background. So you can see, use gravity. If I pick up the board and let it fall down at that angle, gravity will make drips and patterns and all sorts of weird effects. Anything you don't like or that's got a bit too wet, then of course you can use your bit of paper towel and just sort it out. But I think I'm quite happy with that. Oops. I'm just going to remove a bit of moisture from the bottom of the board, because that is a danger area. If you've got puddles, then of course they can bleed back up into the painting and create lots of cauliflower or background effects. And you can see it's already started to do it there. It's right on the edge though, so I'm not too worried about that. If you've got a back run, take out the moisture and then go on with slightly thicker colour over the top, and that will hide it. And of course, if you like that effect, and actually I've got another one there, but I don't mind that. It's quite pretty. So let's leave that one. So let's have a look now at the middle of the flower. So as I said, I've got two browns. I've got burnt sienna, which is a sort of reddish, slightly lighter brown. And that's what I'm going to start off with. Again, being a bit selective with where I put it. It's a bit dark as well, so I'm just going to water that down a bit more. So we want maybe a little bit more light into this ring, this outer ring. But as we're using wet on wet, then chances are that your first layer of yellow has dried a bit too much. It might still be wet in places. You can see I'm putting it on quite loosely, so I'm leaving gaps, which will show the yellow through. Should I put it over the middle? Oh yeah, let's go on. Let's just put it over the middle as well, because that's going to go darker anyway later on. Let me just move the light as well. It's shining on it a bit too much, isn't it? So there we go. You can see what we're doing now. So yeah, there's little gaps where I'm leaving the yellow more visible. And as I said, as we're doing wet on wet, then what you can do is use maybe a little bit of crimson into your blue and create a dark kind of purpley colour. Now purple, especially bluish purple, is going to be a nice complementary colour to the yellow that we've used. So you can see that's lovely how it's bleeding out. So I'm going to use that into this darker section. Some of this is dry, some of it is wet. So I'm making sure that the colour I'm putting on now is quite thick. So that will avoid any cauliflowers happening. So if I put this purple into that wet spot there, it won't create a cauliflower. It will just create a nice kind of bleed. So there we go. Let's put lots of little dots in purple, and then we can also use brown. So the purple's there is a bit of an accent, bit of a different colour, a nice complementary to help make the yellows stand out more. Paul, yes, you can watch the video again, as far as I know. This is the first time I've done it, but it should automatically archive so you can watch it again. So yes, if you're getting a bit lost in the process, and I am moving a little bit faster because I'm looking at the time, then don't worry, you can watch it and recap afterwards. So what I'm doing now is I'm using my darker brown. This is the burnt umber. So umber is a darker brown, and again, reasonably thick paint for watercolour. And the reason is I don't want it to travel too far. So if I go over a wet area with wet paint, it will bleed out, like you can see it's done in the middle. What I want is a little bit more control along the edge, and so I'm using very thick paint. It won't travel quite as far on wet paper. The other option is to dry the painting at this point. So you can use a hairdryer, dry it off, and then you've got lots of control because it will be dry, it won't move when you put the paint over the top. Of course, if you're layering in watercolour, you've got to be reasonably gentle. You've got to be careful that you don't pick up the colour from the previous layers because it remains water soluble. So it's always something you've got to be aware of. The more you fiddle, the more layers you put over the top, the more likely it is that you will end up taking more colour off than you put on, unless you are very, very gentle with it. Okay, so lots and lots of stippling. Basically little dots with the point of my paintbrush. It's quite satisfying, isn't it? I quite like that look where it's slightly softened, it's slightly bleeding out, but it's not going too far. And it's getting that just right, judging it. How wet is the paper? How wet is the paint? How far will it bleed? Sometimes you get it right and sometimes you don't. Hopefully, the more you practice, the more you get it right. And if you do a little bit and it bleeds too far, then wait or dry it off and then come back. So I can see this, I've got a bit of a puddle over here, which I could just soak up with a dry brush a bit. So that's, again, where my paper's buckling, it's just fallen into the dip there. And it was creating a little bit of a puddle. So I won't put this colour on top of that bit because I know it's too wet. It will bleed out too far. So if you can see that there are puddles on the surface, don't put the paint in there yet. Wait a little bit longer. So I'm just going to avoid that spot. I'll come back to it. Okay, and then this central area, what I can do is, again, using quite dry colour, just go in with very dry paint to create a little bit more texture, a little bit more of those spiraling lines. So I've drawn in with pen. So I'm just using those pen lines to indicate where I need to put the paint. So it's creating a little bit more of a 3D centre to our sunflower. Right, okay, let's leave that middle bit to dry a bit more. And then while that's drying, we can have a look at the green areas. So again, use the blue that you've got in your background with your lemon yellow or your lightest yellow that you have available, and create a nice bright green to start you off. Light bright green. So what I've ended up with is something that's like that. If it looks too artificial, too bright, then you can always add in a little bit of red to calm it down. But I think what I want is quite a bright green on this stem to start off with, and then I will darken it. So we have nice bright colour to start with. I'm also going to use that for the stamen. Now this is where you've got to remember we'll find out again using your reference. Which of these little curly bits are stamen? Which of them are petals? Be aware of your background as well. If it's still wet, then make sure that you leave it to dry before you put the green on. If they're dry, if you've got wet background next to the area that you're trying to paint, it will bleed into those areas and form a little bit of a mess. So there we go. That one. And then this one was green. So again, I'm using very bright green to start with, but then I can go over with another layer and darken it. Okay, so originally I think this one was meant to be green as well. I quite like it being yellow. Again, you can put your own little twist on your painting. So if you want to change something from the reference, go for it. Why not? So I think, yeah, I think I'm going to leave that one as yellow. But there was one that I haven't drawn. I can now see. Possibly it was one of those pencil marks that disappeared. That was up here. So just put that in. If I want to, I can go back when it's all dried with pen and outline it again. But I will leave it as is for now. So let's just darken our green up. I'm going to put a teeny bit more blue into it. And then I'm going to put a little bit of red, crimson red, in as well. And that just makes it look a little bit more dark, a little bit more sort of natural green. And that's what I'm going to use, whoops, just on this side. Try not to lean on it. Go upwards a bit. Right. So now you've got the ability to get a bit of light to dark graduation. If it's still wet, you may have slightly softened edges. If it has dried too much, then you've got to be careful and just soften the edge slightly into the layer underneath. So I'm just using a clean, dry brush just to soften those two colours together there. If you have a hairdryer next to you, then I would recommend drying it off and allowing it to dry thoroughly before you put on another layer. I'm being a little bit risky. I'm going straight for it, which I wouldn't normally do, but I just want to get the colour on quickly. So I'm being very gentle. And just overlaying. So I have my very softest brush to do this. It's always a good idea. There we go. So we've got a little bit more of a natural looking green now from the very bright green that we started off with. Okay, I think this is the stage where it really does have to dry before you do anything else to it. So I will use the hairdryer very quickly over it, and then we can just have a look at the little white edges, maybe you need a bit more background around there actually first. I think that's what I'll do. I'll just do that before I put the hairdryer on it. I'll just put a teeny bit more of a darker background colour. Bit closer. And what I'll do is just try and let that bleed out into its surroundings a bit more. So soften it into the blue. And hopefully it will look like it was there all along. So while that's drying off, you can also have a think about looking at the overall painting, seeing what works, what doesn't work, anything that you want to alter, and then make a note of that. If you've got a white pen of any sort, then have a look for that, and we'll see about adding a little bit of white to the stem. If you want to make the center even darker than it is now, I suggest that you do dry it off and then you layer up some more color in glazes over the top. Okay, so if you've used a hairdryer to dry it off, quite often it's a little bit warmer from the hairdryer. But what I would say is do a temperature test normally. So if the unpainted paper is warmer than the painted area, once it's cooled off from the hairdryer, and then you know that you need to leave the painted area a little bit longer. So this should be the same temperature. It shouldn't be any colder. If it is colder, then it means that it's still drying inside the paper. You need to leave it just a teeny bit longer. Right then, so if you have a white pen, so a gel pen or a white drawing pen or a Posca pen, something like that, then you can use those to add some more white dots, little stippled marks along the edge, the same way that you did with the black dots, to help create a bit of a furry sort of edge. So some white pens work better than others. They cover a little bit more, they're more opaque. Test out what works best. If your white pen isn't showing up enough, then you could use a bit of white gouache painted on in little dots. But you can see that it's just a soft little effect, just softly creating some dots. And of course, you can do that over the top of the green as well. So that's, again, a quite a time-consuming little thing to do, but it does add a lovely effect. Once you're happy with the colours that you've got down. So you can hopefully see how that works. Of course, if you've got white, as I have, I've got a little white gap here, it's not going to work quite as well, but you can still go over the green area. And generally, if you've got part of the edge done in this manner, then it will trick you into believing that it's the same texture all the way up and down. So you can also put some of those dots into the middle as well, because of course the fuzzy texture continues all the way across, and those white dots, they will show up best on the darker green areas, but put in as many as you feel it needs. So generally the best place if you're putting any sort of texture, the best place to concentrate is the outside edge. But of course you can put some into the middle section as well. So it just gives it a nice soft, slightly fluffy look. Okay, and then as I said, if you do want to do anything else to the colour of the flower, then it's going to be done in a glaze, which is sort of watered down colour put over the top of what's already there. So you're not going to move what's there. It should all be dry. But then you can work your way over. So if you want to create a little bit more strong yellow in some places, then just have a look at getting a bit more strength to the yellow, putting that on. So not everywhere, I'm leaving some of the petals that are catching the light as they are, but I'm just putting in a bit more strength to the yellow in some areas, brightening it up. So the ones behind especially could go a little bit darker. And then you can also think about whether you want to add any more dark to the middle section, just as a finishing off little thing. So again, more dots if you want. That's where I didn't do the dots to start with. You could do a wash, a glaze wash over the whole thing if it is too light, or you can just build it up in more dots. And lastly, you can also go back in with more pen, more lines on the dry areas if you want to. So that's sort of one area where I could go back and just create a bit of an outline around that added in little sepal behind there. And if I wanted to put some more dots, more texture into the middle section, again, wait for that to dry, and then you can go and draw more over the top. So even if you put paint on, it doesn't mean it's the end of the process. You can go back to drawing. Just do what you like to finish it off until you're happy with your painting. Okay, so I hope that you've been able to follow along the process and you found that helpful. If you've got any questions, any comments, put them in the chat. And basically then I hope you've sort of enjoyed a little moment of calm in the chaos that's going on at the moment. And please do put these sunflowers on social media, post them up wherever you like. And basically our thoughts, our prayers for all the people in Ukraine or anyone else in the world that have caught up in conflicts and wars in other parts of the world. So our sunflowers, they should stand for sort of peace and just saying that our thoughts are with you. So a small gesture, but if we all make one small gesture, it should hopefully add our voice to a much larger movement. Okay, so I'm going to say goodbye for now. I will have a look through the comments. So if you are watching after the live event, I will have a look through the comments and I will try to answer your questions there. So thank you very much for watching, for joining in, and hopefully see some of you at a later point in my classes, workshops, wherever you join me. Thank you. Okay, so thanks, Susan, Fiona, Alan, and I will see you later. So thank you very much for watching, and bye-bye for now.